What's up guys, Retro YuGiOh, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing a meta tier list for the upcoming September 25th format post Banlist. This is just my opinion, so let's get started. Okay, I'm just going to get started with the best decks of the format. We're going to start with Unchained. Unchained, relatively pretty much unchanged, no pun intended, but this is going to be the best deck of the form, one of the expected best decks of the format. It's already been having very good results with a lot of top players piloting the deck, like Jesse Cotton and yugiohtcg. The deck is very well positioned, and you can see when you get a very high level player piloting the deck that it can essentially play around anything. You can play around Nibiru, you can play around evenly matched. Essentially every single board breaker in the format can be played around, and the better the player, the better the pilot, the more you'll see that. So this deck is definitely going to be tier 1. It just doesn't have any clear, obvious counters. It's more, the thing that counters this deck is going to be very good players outplaying the other person, much like, say, tier limit format. Next we have Pearly. Pearly is going to probably be the other tier 1 deck of the format. So it's going to be, I guess, pun intended, cats and dog format. Pearly is still well positioned. It's not very much hit in any way. You still have the draw 6 combo available, and that can be kind of impactful. Maybe it's not as relevant though if we're playing less hand traps now, because a lot of the top decks, well, these two top decks here, really aren't impacted by hand traps. So that's something we have to consider moving forward, that everything under these decks, or every other deck in this tier list, is going to be taken into consideration how well you match up with these two top decks. So let's get started on that one. Adventure Synchron. I think this deck is a rogue deck. Now, I believe this deck has potential to take wins off any of the top decks. Like, it's the same as every other combo deck. When you resolve your combo, you're going to have pretty much an auto win go first. The problem is how you go about getting to that combo. In this deck, it loses to a lot of floodgates and board breakers. Like, so Dimensional Barrier is one of those cards that's getting considered because it's very good versus Pearly. It's also very good natural counter to Adventure Synchron because, well, Synchron deck. In addition, this deck plays a lot of bricks, so the consistency going first isn't as strong as other combo decks. That being said, when you resolve your combo going first, you can Calamities Lock, you can set up the full negation with like Barone, Crystal Wing, anything. Pretty much as much imagination as you have, this deck can do it. But again, representation in top cut numbers from the past formats, we haven't really seen a big change that should give you a reason to think this deck will get better. But yeah, that's where we're at. Altergeist, where do I want to put this? I'm going to put it rogue. It's just not a very good deck. It's not as good as the other trap control decks. It has nice support in from Duelist Nexus. It can, again, have the potential to contend versus any of the top decks when you resolve your combo going first. But again, it's not necessarily well positioned with representation or just its end goal. Now, it could get better because Unchained, the way to deal with Unchained is non-targeting, non-destruction and removal. This deck does have that in Altergeist Siliquidus, right? You can just bounce something back to hand. So that's one thing there. Unfortunately, it's just not well positioned. That's just where I'm sitting on this deck. Maybe someone could prove me wrong, but for now we're putting it here. Branded is tier 3. Branded suffers from the same thing Branded has always suffered from, Ash Blossom on Branded Fusion. But in addition, people are playing cards like Dimensional Barrier and Triple Tactics Thrust. Therefore, this deck is much worse off. Having to go second into Dimensional Barrier, it's just a turn skip, really. Not much else you can say. However, Branded Chimera is a tier 2 deck. This deck, while it may have trouble with Dimensional Barrier when it goes second, when it goes first, you have a lot more resilience to cards like Ash Blossom and hand traps in general. They can also set up a board where they can also set up their combo where they're going to take a card out of your hand. That's important. They have effect negation with Mirror Sword Knight, so that's another bonus. The Chimera Fusion is a very powerful card. They can quick fuse into what's it called, Guardian Chimera to destroy cards and pop them. Just an overall very powerful strategy, Branded Chimera. And people say, oh, but what about Ash on Branded Fusion? The Ash Blossom on Branded Fusion is not as impactful. This deck uses Branded Fusion as another starter card, right? They have enough starter cards with Kotal and Mirror Sword Knight. Branded Fusion is just an extra thing. They don't need to resolve Branded Fusion to win. That's why this deck is definitely going to be tier 2. Dark World is also, in my opinion, tier 2. I think Dark World is very well positioned right now, with the best decks not really, in fact, the decks this format are not playing Droll. Bestials have been reduced because of Bestial Magnemite's reduction, so that's something there to consider. This deck, if you don't have hard counters to this deck, it can just run wild and it can easily loop you for 5 cards on turn 1. However, the problem with Dark World is if it starts to get really good, people are going to play counters to it, and the counters to Dark World, they essentially shut the deck down. Stuff like Anti-Spell, stuff like Eradicator, and Droll and Lock, Bestials. If people start playing more because Dark World gets better, Dark World is only going to be worse. But right now I think it's well positioned because, well, again, no one's playing those cards. And you have stuff like the tactics cards like Thrust and Talents, which you can trigger because you give your opponent Ceruli, and then Ceruli triggers on your opponent's side of the field as their monster, making your Thrust and Talents live. So Dark World, very well positioned. Another card people might be concerned about is Dragon Link. Dragon Link is very much a playable deck. They lost 1 Magnemite and 1 Chaos Space. That is consistency hits only. The deck still has the exact same endboard ceiling and the same playability going second. It's not really hindered in any way. It's much less, remains unchanged from last format. Just 4 consistency cards, but are not massively significant. Exosister, I'm going to put in the Rogue tier. While I may think this deck is good enough to be tier 3, I think it's more Rogue. It has less representation. But however, it does have good interaction versus Unchained, as it does have the non-destruction removal, which is something good against Unchained. It's not well positioned against many other decks. And again, Dimensional Barrier, flip it, call Exceed. It's one of those things that if your deck cannot play through Dimensional Barrier, you're going to have an issue, right? Because a lot of the best decks are getting targeted by that. So like Pearly, Branded, Chimera, those decks are getting hit by stuff like that. So a lot of the rogue decks that would also lose to that are going to have an issue. That's why they've got to be down their bottom. Flu. My god, I really hope this doesn't stay like this, but Floowandereeze is well positioned right now. It has a very good Unchained matchup, and I hope that does not continue because I do not like this deck and I never want to see it again. So bye-bye Flu, please don't come back. Bye. Punk Gold Pride, definitely rogue. This deck, again, the same things. It loses to a lot of what the modern format is right now, and the overall engine can be kind of tricky to play through. Hand traps, board breakers. It's not very good right now. Heroes, positioned in the exact same spot. This deck, you always see the casual players piloting this deck. Maybe one of them gets a top, it gets a bit more popular, but then it drops off. It doesn't have the overall representation. The engine is not really good enough to compete at the highest levels. It's nothing more than a rogue deck. What is not a rogue deck is Infernoble Knight. It is a tier 3 deck. Its engine alone, again, it's the same as many other combo decks, where it can be very devastating when they resolve full combo. Unfortunately, they lose to, again, a lot of what is currently in the meta. Summon Limit is very popular Floodgate right now. Other stuff like, what is it? What's the Floodgate that you can only control one monster of each type? Tikaboo, and it's a whole warrior deck, so that's a little bit of an issue for them there. And then, yeah, Droll, Nib, Ash, Imperm, those are all kind of impactful versus this deck. Kashtira, while they lost a Rise Heart, this deck is still fine. It's still positioned in a decent spot. They can play Shifter, which is a good counter for the meta. Fenrir and Unicorn are still very impactful monsters. They have impact over the state of the game. Birth is a very annoying spell to deal with, banishing 3 cards from the grave whenever you use a spell card or effect. locking zones, setting up level 7s. Just it's not a bad deck, but it doesn't have really that finisher that it had before. This is probably my opinion of the best trap deck of the format. Labyrinth. The furniture build specifically can play on your turn, on their turn 0, where they can set up any floodgate they want, so like Eradicator, Dimensional Barrier, just anything they want they can really just get to. This deck is annoying. It's only going to get better when Age of Overlord support comes out, but for now it's tier 2. It does have a good matchup with the Big Welcome being able to be non-destruction removal for Unchained, but yeah, it's just a tier 2 deck at the moment. Monadium is probably the best combo deck in my opinion. It has enough resilience to play through everything outside of Droll, and if you build the deck right, there are ways to play through Dimensional Barrier where it's not actually going to like end your turn, and I don't think a lot of the Monadium players have realized that yet. That said, again, a lot of the counters to this deck, unless you're going for the Calamities lock, not very good. Like Book of Eclipse is still in the format, Tactics Thrusts are still in the format, Ash Blossom is not that impactful, but if Droll sees more play, Droll can be very impactful, sometimes pass your turn. So that's something to consider, but I think the deck is pretty decent at the moment. Marine Cess, it's a rogue deck. Not really much to say here about this. It's just, if you can out there Towers monster, then the deck doesn't really do much else. And everyone's playing a lot of board breakers right now. So that has got some benefit to this deck, being able to negate the spell traps, but again, can be kind of problematic. Math Mech or Cybers decks in general, just not very good. Their overall engine just struggles. Sure, people are not using hand traps. Bestials are a little bit less now, which can be nice for them. Their game plan, it's not inducive of a very good strategy. Like Drumador Karma Cannon is one of those cards that's actually being sided a lot, and that card can be fairly devastating to this deck. Mekanko's in the same category right now, where I think it's actually it's in the same category as Rogue, but it has a lot of more potential. Like, I think this deck could actually beat a lot of other decks because people don't know how to play against it. Unfortunately, Book of Eclipse is still one of the best cards and most heavily sided and main deck staples in the format, and it has probably the best counter to Mekanko's. Non-targeting, sets them face down, at the board, do your damage, you win. Rescue Ace, I want to give it the respect. It belongs in tier 2. It could probably go down to tier 3. I don't necessarily think this deck is good. I just think it's been piloted by a very good pilot in Max Reynolds to a runner-up finish at YCS Cancun, and for that reason, I'm going to give it respect and put it in tier 2. I don't think it's good enough to be any higher. Rika Sun Avalon. I'm going to... Rika Sun Avalon. Tier 3. While this deck has a good end board, turn 1 if they go uninterrupted, everyone's playing Ash Blossom, and if you know where to interact with this deck, it makes it a lot weaker. I think the surprise factor of Rika Sun Avalon is gone. Their end board's still decent, but again, outside Sunseed Jess, it really hasn't had any results or representation. Runic Stun, I'm going to put tier 3. Again, I think all stun decks have a spot in the format, especially with all the floodgates that are available. However, you look at what it does versus the top decks, like Pearly and Unchained. It's destruction removal. That's not good versus Unchained. It's targeting versus Pearly. That's not very good because they have the field spell. So again, not very good versus the best decks. This is where it's probably positioned. Has some application versus the other decks, but just in general, I don't think the deck is overall very good. Solomon Great, I know they got the third Gazelle. I'm going to put it at Rogue at the moment. It could potentially move up to tier 3, maybe even tier 2, but for now, Rogue. We got to see more results stack up. So that's really where we're at. Sky Striker is Rogue. It's the Sky Striker engine itself as a pure deck is just out. It's just very dated. The cards just don't do enough. They don't have enough impact in the meta. They have a lot of natural counters in the format, like Erad, Anti-Spell, enough hand traps, whatever you want to say. It's just, the engine's outdated. It just doesn't impact the format enough anymore. Maybe it can be used as a engine like we saw in Orchest, but for a standalone deck, it's just not powerful enough. Sprite, I want to put Sprite here at tier 3. I think just the Sprite deck itself and Sprite variants are overall kind of weak in what I expect the current format to be. I don't know if they'll see the overall results. I don't know if they'll be able to combat against the format, how it develops. I think they're good. It's a good deck when the format's more hand trap reliant. But when we see a format that's more board breaker reliant, like Tactics and Thrusts, Book of Eclipse, I don't feel like Sprite's well positioned enough to impact the format. Sword Soul, it's a rogue deck right now. Unfortunately, the thing with the issue with Sword Soul is like what the modern format counters are, like Dimensional Barrier, Nibiru might be still played in some side decks. This deck's not well positioned. When it just hasn't, it's got a lot of counters to, like, it's countered by what the top decks are being countered by. The overall engine itself is not great. It's very much of a mid engine. It doesn't do enough. Setting up one negate, one omni negate, one monster effect negation, and then a destruction removal in the trap card in the modern format is just not very good, especially with something like Unchained where they are destruction removal, not very good. And against Pearly where they have to target and they have the field spell access, it makes it worse. Tier limits. Without Kashtira, a Rise Heart in the format, this deck actually has the potential to be very good. We could see the milling strategies come out now. We also lost a couple Bestial Magnemite, so that makes this deck even more, got more potential. Just someone's going to make something with tier limits that will be very interesting to see, and I'm excited for it. But yeah, this deck, without that, I think it's well positioned. Outside of Fluanderees, there's not really any good shifter decks in the format, so tier limits is well positioned to have an impact in the format. Trap Tricks, not very good. It's just a rogue deck. It's a worse trap deck than, say, Altergeist, or a worse trap deck by far than Labyrinth. The monsters are kind of okay because they can play through a lot of the floods. That being said, I don't necessarily think this deck is very well positioned at the moment, outside of being a rogue deck. And then Vanquish Soul is probably my biggest disappointment. Vanquish Soul, I want this deck to be good, but it is just so sad that it's not. It's like a deck that can play a bunch of hand traps for engine, a deck that can play Tikaboo because it doesn't fold to Tikaboo. It's got a pretty busted link 1. It can do burn. It can do all this stuff, but the overall impact of the cards is just so low. It just doesn't have the overall impact in the meta right now compared to other better decks. But yeah, that's it, guys. That's just my opinion. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Did I miss any deck? I'll try to answer as many comments as possible. But hey, remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content, and I'll see you next time.